So I'm delighted to be back with you again, Victoria Club. It's always a pleasure to present to you, and I'm just up the road in Nanaimo, but I don't get to Victoria nearly enough, so it's nice to be with you at least this way. Um, I remember as a kid being absolutely fascinated by little things and watching ants and bees and taking flowers apart to see how they were put together and just being really fascinated with all these things that the grown-ups didn't seem to be very interested in, but I thought they were really interesting. And one of the first toys I ever bought myself with my small allowance was a little microscope, and I had a lot of fun looking at things through my microscope. And I still love looking closely at things that are right there in front of us, but that we normally don't pay any attention to. And science now is able to tell us that experiencing that sense of wonder and awe that I felt as a kid and that I still feel is actually good for our mental health. There's a lot of joy in just appreciating the small, ordinary miracles that are all around us. So macro photography fits very well with that sort of attitude to life. And tonight, we're going to look at a few aspects of macro. My goal tonight is to get you excited about macro and to give you some information that can help you get started, and maybe some tips if you're already started that might help you along the way. I think once you get into it, the sky's the limit with macro. It's absolutely amazing what you can do with today's technology. And with winter coming on, it's the perfect time to play inside with macro and close-ups. So we're going to talk about the term macro versus the term close-up and what those mean. We're going to talk about gear. That's not something I usually talk about very much in my presentations, but there is some special gear that you need to consider for macro. We'll talk about lighting, as well as just some basic how-tos, how to get started, and some challenges and tips. You're going to run into a few things that you normally don't have to think about in photography generally, but they come up in macro work. And then we're going to have a break. And after the break, we're going to talk about focus stacking, which is a very powerful technique, but a little bit tricky if nobody shows you how to do it. And I'll also leave you with some resources for further study. So I suppose you could argue that this is a close-up photograph. And in terms of a 45-foot long whale with a 15-foot wide tail, yeah, I guess it is. By the way, all the regulations for whale watching were respected here. We were still in the water and the whale came to us. But normally we're not thinking about these kinds of subjects with close-up. We're thinking about much smaller kinds of subjects. We're talking about subjects that in fact are in the range of maybe the size of a deck of cards or a business card, or even smaller than that. And this macro shot of a hummingbird covers an area less than 2 inches wide. So this is much more in the realm of real close-up work. Terms close-up and macro are sometimes used interchangeably, and I often use them interchangeably. But if you want to get technical about it, they're not exactly the same thing. So the definitions of close-up can vary quite a bit and be quite subjective, but true macro is defined as a 1-to-1 ratio. And what that means is that the subject completely fills the sensor. And so in this slide, the red box is the actual size of a full frame sensor. And the green box is the actual size of a Micro Four Thirds sensor. And a crop sensor is somewhere in between the two. So if in your full frame image, you have an area larger than the red box, then it's technically not macro. Now, some groups consider that if you fill the frame with a subject smaller than a business card, they will consider that macro. The point of going into this is not really to split hairs, but simply to point out that if you want to compete in a macro competition, you have to read the brief and make sure that you're fitting within their requirements, because some of those competitions are strictly macro. Many of them are close-up and macro, but you do need to know. So these two flower images are around a business card size field of view. It's a gladiola on the left and an amaryllis on the right. A lot of my macro and close-up work is focus stacked. I have trouble finding stuff in my macro work that isn't focus stacked. And both of these are focus stack, and we're going to get into much more detail about that later. But if you look at them and you think, wow, I don't get depth of field like that, the reason is that these are focus stacked, and you'll understand better by the end of the evening. Most of my work is actually close-up work rather than true one-to-one macro, although I do a little bit of that. This calla lily was about 5 inches wide, so obviously not true macro, but it's certainly within the close-up range. And this is one of the photographs that was awarded honorable mention in the 2021 International Close-Up Photographer of the Year Awards. And by the way, if you go to that website, Close-Up Photographer of the Year, they've got some really good information there and some very inspiring photographs. And they also have a really good newsletter that I find quite thought-provoking. It's not always just about close-up, but it's one of the more inspiring newsletters that I subscribe to. Sometimes I shoot whole flowers, and sometimes I shoot parts of flowers. Flowers are definitely my main subject when it comes to macro, not the only one, but certainly the main one. So I look at my subject and decide what draws me, and then I shoot that. This triptych is 3 shots of the back of the same sunflower. Now, if you've seen me present before, you know that I usually just use my own photos in my presentations. But when I do macro work, I don't have a lot besides flowers to show you. And so there are so many other subjects that you can work with. I want to share some images from a couple of other folks who are doing really great work. The first is Don Komarechka, a brilliant young Canadian photographer who I consider to be the king of macro. And Komarechka is a little hard to spell, but thankfully he's made his website doncom.ca. And his book is the best resource I know. And I'm going to show you at the end of the presentation the cover of that book, so you can take a screenshot, and if you decide that you'd like to get that book, you'll know what to look for. I bought it as an ebook because I want to be able to search it easily, and I can have it on my phone, but it's also available as a very beautiful coffee table book. In his book, he goes into tremendous detail. He's quite sciencey. He's kind of a nerdy guy, and I say that in a very affectionate and positive way. He explains things well, but he's really into the science. And he goes into the details of how to do a number of different macro projects. And this is a frozen soap bubble on a branch of his Christmas tree. Now, this can be a bit challenging for us on Vancouver Island because we don't often get cold enough to do frozen soap bubbles. But every once in a while, we get lucky enough to have a short cold spell, and this can be worth trying. But he goes into the details, how to make the solution, how to make the bubble stay, very detailed information. He also talks about ultraviolet-induced visible fluorescence. There's a mouthful. He calls it UVIVF. And what he's found is that some subjects fluoresce when you expose them to ultraviolet light. If you put those subjects into a dark room and light them with a UV light, they produce some amazing colors. And there are lots of UV flashlights available if you look on Amazon. Some of them are good and some of them are not very good. I know Don Komarechka recommends the Adaptalux UV lights. They're not cheap, but they're very good quality. Just be aware, if you decide to play in this ultraviolet playpen, you do need to use safety goggles when you're using that to protect your vision. Now, the next slide has a spider on it, and I warn you, because I know some of you don't like spiders. And actually, I freak out over spiders too, but I think this one's kind of cute. This is a fellow named Ethan Beckler in the States. He has a website called One of One Images. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Ethan when he visited a fine art group that I'm part of. We did a Zoom interview with him, and he does the most amazing stuff. He specializes in grains of sand and other subjects that are often just a fraction of a millimeter in size. So this is a garnet grain of sand held by a tiny, tiny jumping spider. And Ethan has a variety of other subjects, including stacks of grains of sand, moth wings, snowflakes, and all kinds of other subjects. Here's another one of Ethan's shots. This is a single grain of sand, a garnet crystal, sitting on a bit of pollen. And to give you an idea of how big that actually is, here it is sitting beside a standard size Lego head. So if you've got grandkids, you know how small those Lego heads are. And in that red circle is that little bit of pollen with the grain of sand sitting on it. This guy's work just blows my mind. He goes so much more into magnification than I do. And then there are people who use microscopes for their photography. And Peter Dzik does a lot of abstracts within macro, quite beautiful ones. He uses a microscope with his camera to get really highly magnified images, 10 times magnified, 20 times magnified. This is a melt of kojic acid in polarized light. And it's magnified 10 times through his microscope, and he's used a manual flash to light it for the photograph. Does beautiful things. And he often posts on a Facebook group. I think it's called Close Up Photographer of the Year. There's quite a bit of really, really good work on that Facebook group. But you don't have to have a microscope to do close-up abstracts. This is a series of abstracts that I did of calla lily leaves that got honorable mention in this year's International Minimalist Photography Awards. So let's talk a little bit about gear. We were talking about phones before we started the presentation. And a lot of phones these days can do macro. For years, a company called Moment and some others have made macro lens attachments that you could add on to your phone. But now a lot of phones actually have macro capability built in. This shot of the quarter is straight out of camera from an iPhone 13 Pro. And the quality of these shots is fine for social media. But I prefer a longer lens for macro and close-ups, partly because I don't care for the subject distortion that I get with my phone. And also, I sell prints. And when I look at the images from my phone at 100%, the quality of the phone shots doesn't stand up to that of my camera. There's a noticeable difference in image quality. And I would hope there would be with what we pay for our camera gear. So I rarely use my phone for macro work or really any kind of serious photography. Your experience may differ from mine. I have a friend who hiked 500 miles of the Camino in Spain a year ago, and she used her phone for all her photography. So I just prefer using a camera when I can. Some point and shoot cameras out there do some decent macro. The ones I'm familiar with are the Olympus cameras. They have a line of cameras called the Tough series. This is the TG7, which was only released about a month ago. It shoots in RAW, and it has 4 macro modes with up to 44.4 times magnification, which is pretty amazing. They actually call it a micro mode. And the focusing distance on this is down to 1 centimeter of distance from the lens. It's also got built-in focus bracketing, and you'll learn more about that later. It'll do up to 30 frames, and it'll do in-camera focus stacking of a maximum of 10 frames. It's very rugged, it's waterproof, you can use it underwater to 15 meters, and it's $550. So, you know, if you want to play around with macro and you don't want to invest in a whole camera or a lens, that's a pretty inexpensive way to get started, and you can take it to Hawaii with you and use it when you're snorkeling. Very rugged too. I bought one for my husband. He's not the gentlest guy in the world when it comes to stuff, and I thought this one would survive, which it did. I actually had the Olympus TG4, which came out several years ago, and it had the micro mode and RAW. When they moved to the TG5, for some reason, they got rid of RAW shooting, and it was JPEG only. So I can't recommend that one, but the TG6 and TG7 have gone back to RAW. This is an image I took with the old TG4 in its micro mode in RAW. I had this camera with me when I did a workshop with Freeman Patterson a few years ago, and his teaching partner, Andre Gallant, was quite fascinated with this little camera I was using, and he borrowed it for an afternoon. And after he played with the macro on it, he went out and bought one. So that tells you there's some quality there. Now, when it comes to cameras, these days, it's really hard to buy a bad camera. Although some may be better suited for macro than others. I'm not affiliated with any companies, but I have chosen to shoot with an OM1 and Olympus lenses, and I love my Olympus macro lens. The main reasons that I moved from Nikon to Olympus about 10 years ago were size, weight, and cost. But a bonus for me is that my macro lens gives a closer in view due to the Micro Four Thirds sensor. So if we go back to this slide showing you sensor size, if you take a 1:1 macro shot with a true macro lens on your full frame camera, and I do the same on my OM1 Micro Four Thirds camera, my shot will show half the area. In other words, twice the magnification, because the sensor is smaller. And for the kind of work that I do, that's a big advantage. And not just in macro work, but also if I shoot wildlife. Now, you could argue that with enough megapixels and a larger sensor, you can just crop the full frame shot. And you would be absolutely right. That's true. But for me, the size, weight, and cost, along with the field of view, make it very worthwhile. So if you don't want to go to the expense of a macro lens to start with, extension tubes are an inexpensive option. They're a good way to start if you're not sure if you're really going to get into macro. And the way they work, you attach them to the camera and then you attach the lens. In other words, they fit between the camera and the lens, and they have electrical contacts, or at least some of them do, and I recommend you get ones that do. They have electrical contacts so the lens and the camera can still communicate. They allow you to focus much closer to your subject. So if you can normally focus at 2 feet from your subject, you put the extension tubes on, you might find you can go to a foot or 8 inches. They let you get closer and gives you some magnification. And the beauty of extension tubes is you still have the same image quality from your lens that you would get without the extension tubes, because there is no added glass to degrade the image quality. And that, for me, that's an important consideration. Another advantage is that if you decide to get a macro lens later, you buy the extension tubes, you use them, you like them, you want to do more macro, and you go and get a macro lens, you can use the extension tubes with your macro lens to get even greater magnification. So it's not like you're throwing away money if you buy a macro lens later. Kenko is a good brand for extension tubes. There are probably others, but I know this is the one that Don Komarechka also recommends. The set I bought is a 10 millimeter plus a 16 millimeter. And you can use one at a time, or you can use both of them at once. The only thing you have to watch is that the total focal length of the extension tubes can't be greater than the focal length of the lens you're using them on. So I've got 26 millimeters here. So as long as my lens is more than 26 millimeters, I can use them. I'm sorry, 36. Yeah, 26 millimeters. The cost of this set was about $225 Canadian. And compare that with my macro lens cost me $560. Many macro lenses are much more expensive than that. I did mention cost is one of the things I like about Olympus. And there are lots of other ways to do macro too. Reversing rings and bellows were quite popular back in the film days, and those can still be used. But I find extension tubes are the simplest option if you don't have a macro lens. Another option that some people like is a close-up filter, and I think that's what the gentleman was talking about that he has in his camera kit. It's basically a piece of glass, like a filter, that attaches to the front of your lens to magnify the subject. Unlike extension tubes, though, it does add a layer of glass that may compromise your image quality. I know Canon makes a close-up lens that used to be considered quite good. You know, you would expect Canon to have decent glass. And it didn't have to be used just on a Canon camera. It could be used on any camera. So there are lots of options for these close-up filters, but Raynox has a particularly good reputation. The one you're seeing on the slide is a Raynox 250, and it gives you 2.5 times magnification and costs less than $100. As I said, I'm not really a fan of these filters because of the extra glass they introduce. I really suggest that you start with extension tubes and then move to a macro lens if you want to do that. You can add close-up filters to the lens and the extension tubes if you want to for even greater magnification. And I think that's how Ethan Beckler gets some of those amazing shots with the grains of sand and so forth. I actually bought the Raynox 250 and ended up returning it. I found that I preferred working with just my macro lens or my macro lens with the extension tubes. And you might be different. You might find that you really like these. And then there are true macro lenses. Now, there are some things to be aware of when you're shopping for a macro lens. Lots of lenses have macro in the name, but are not true macro lenses. If it says 2:1, like 2:1 on your lens, it is not a true macro lens, as the ratio of the subject to the sensor in that lens is 2:1 rather than 1:1. And there are now macro lenses up to 1:5 and even higher, I believe now. So true macro lenses tend to have close focusing distance. Many of them are prime lenses. They tend to be very sharp and most often fast lenses with nice bokeh. The three lenses you see here, the Sigma 105, the Micro Nikkor 105, and the Olympus 60, which is a 120 millimeter full frame equivalent, are all excellent macro lenses. You'll find that macro lenses come in different focal lengths. You can get short ones or long ones. For example, Olympus and OM Systems offer a 30 millimeter, a 60 millimeter, and a 90 millimeter macro lens. And in full frame equivalent, that's 60, 120, and 180. So how do you choose? How do you decide what focal length? Well, I think that short can be good for flowers and studio work. Long is great for insects, where you can't necessarily get as close as you might like to. I chose 60 millimeters because it doesn't have the subject distortion that can come with shorter focal lengths. And being a 120 equivalent in full frame terms, it's really a beautiful portrait lens. So I bought it partly because it's so versatile. I can use it for flowers and turn around and use it for portraits. If I was shooting insects in the field, I might prefer something longer. And Don Komarechka's book has some good recommendations, but you can't really go wrong with Sigma if you want to go to a third-party lens. And you don't have to buy your macro lens from the manufacturer who made your camera. There are some good third-party options. I've mentioned Sigma. These are Laowa lenses. And the one on the left is the Laowa 2.5. 2.5 to 5 times macro. So it's a very specialized lens that gives you 2.5 to 5 times magnification. But it is so specialized that you can only focus very close. You can't use this as a general purpose lens. You couldn't shoot portraits or landscapes or anything like that with this. It's strictly for macro. And it is manual focus only, which that is not really a drawback, because when you're doing macro, manual focus is a good way to go anyway. But you really need a focusing rail if you're using something like this. And we're going to talk a little bit about focusing rails later on. The lens on the right is the Laowa 100 millimeter 2.8 2 times macro. And that can shoot at 1:1 or 1:2, and it can focus to infinity. So this is worth considering as your multi-purpose lens. Once you've got the lens, you may need to think about something to steady your subject, because any movement of your subject is going to be magnified. Just as the subject itself is magnified, so is any movement that happens. And so you may need something to hold your subject still. I often use a Wimberley Plamp, even indoors actually, and that's what you see on the top left of this slide. Outside, if there's any breeze, it can really help keep a flower steady. You clamp the red end of the clamp to a table or your tripod center column or a stake stuck in the ground. And then the other end has a very gentle clamp to hold a flower stem without crushing it. The other device you see in the lower right there is sometimes called a third hand. It's a device that is often used for soldering. You'll find computer techs have these kinds of things to hold things. And they come with various different numbers of clamps. You could use this to hold more than one flower, for example. Sometimes I want to shoot flowers and give sort of a sense of relationship between them. So I might have each flower in its own clamp and then position the flowers for what I want. Or you can use one to hold a flower and another to hold a background. Or if you're shooting insects that, dead insect on a pin, you can use that clamp to hold the subject where you want it. I don't have one of these third hand devices, but I do have a friend who has one, and she quite likes it for what she does indoors. The clamps, though, are less gentle, and they definitely could crush a flower stem if you had a flower with a delicate stem. And a tripod is very, very important if you're doing macro work. Just as your subject and any movement in it are magnified, so is camera shake. The slightest amount of movement can throw off your focus when you're doing macro. So I really recommend a sturdy tripod used on a hard surface. And I use a remote shutter release or shutter delay. I prefer the inexpensive wired shutter release. There's less to go wrong with them, but you can also use an app on your phone. I do a lot of my work, my studio work, in my dining room. And unfortunately, I have a very thick plush carpet in my dining room. And I have found that if I use my tripod on that plush carpet, the tripod can settle enough to ruin the shot if I'm shooting with a slow shutter speed or doing focus bracketing. So, it took me a little while to figure out why I wasn't rock hard steady. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, this carpet I like so much on my feet, it's sabotaging my tripod. So, yeah, sometimes I'll move into a room with hardwood floor to do that kind of stuff. I've also thought about, I know you can get ice, like picks that you can put on the feet of some tripods for being on ice. And I thought if I got a couple of those, if I got one for each leg and put them right down to the subfloor, that might do the job too. I have to look into that. So I'm going to go on next to talking about how to get started doing macro, but are there any questions about gear before I do that? Just unmute yourself to ask if you've got any questions.
Judy, I have a Canon 100, and on the Canon 100, it's got three options: full, 0.5 M to infinity,
yes,
0.3 M to 0.5 M.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered what is the better option, or how you go about using that to its best advantage. So maybe at some point you might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know that that particular lens. It's a long time since I used to shoot Canon, but it sounds like it might be kind of similar to my Olympus macro lens, which has what I call a clutch on it that you can set it for different distances. And there's a 1-to-1 setting where you just set it on that, and then you don't move the focus ring, you move the camera back and forth till you get the subject sharp. Or I set it on one of the other settings if I'm not doing true 1-to-1. And what it does is it helps the camera not hunt for focus so much. So I will often use autofocus to get close to the focus point I want for my macro, and then I'll switch to manual and fine tune it. And I suspect that that function on your Canon lens might be somewhat similar. Does that make sense to you?
I'll go back and reread the Canon manual, which isn't they don't provide the best information.
Well, the other thing is, if you want to send me a photo of your lens, of the part of it you're talking about, I might be able to figure that out and get back to you.
Thank you very much.
There's a form on my website that you can send me a message. And if it doesn't allow you to put an attachment, just email me, and then we'll email and you can send me the attachment. And I'll try to figure that out for you.
Again, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions before we move on?
There's a question from Kathy Carter. She has a question about a per gear lens for macro. So Kathy, did you want to ask your question?
What kind of lens?
Pergear. I might not be pronouncing it correctly. Pergear.
I've never heard of it. Kathy, do you want to jump in and elaborate on that? What kind of camera are you using?
You might need to unmute yourself, Kathy.
Maybe we scared her off. I'll carry on and we can raise that question again at any point when we're taking more questions.
Sure.
So getting started, I would really suggest that if you haven't done macro before, you postpone the true macro and start with doing close-ups. That will help you to learn about focusing and depth of field and that sort of thing. And it's a little bit more forgiving than true macro. And at least to start with, use a tripod set up on a hard surface. So choose a subject like this maple leaf was maybe, I don't know, 6-8 inches long. And I just set it on some black glass with a black background in window light and got my shot. And that one got a gold medal from CAPA. Focus is trickier in macro than in most photography. You have much less margin for error when you're shooting a small subject. As I mentioned, manual focus is most often best, and you want to have your camera set up for a single point of focus. When you get your camera, most of them come so that the default setting has all of the focus points that are included in the camera's capability, all active. And if you use that, what it basically does is it gives the camera permission to focus on whatever it wants to. And that is not what you want. I don't use that for anything except maybe when the Snowbirds air show is on in a blank sky, and it can grab the airplanes that way. But you can go into your menu on your camera and you can set your focus point. And on the newer cameras, you get many more focus points available. I always set my focus point for one single focus point. And then I move that point onto the area that I want tack sharp. And then I rotate my focusing ring until I get that area tack sharp. I use that for all photos pretty much because it's so much more accurate. And then if your camera has focus peaking, use that. It is a tremendously helpful thing. Focus peaking is found on most mirrorless cameras. If you have a DSLR camera, you might have it, but it was probably called something like Focus Assist for Live View. And what focus peaking does is it puts a colored outline over the part of the image that is sharp. So in this photo from Adobe's website, it shows what it looks like. This sheep is going to have those areas that are in red will be sharp. The rest of the sheep may not be. On mirrorless cameras, one of the things I love about mirrorless is you can see this through the viewfinder. I like to shoot traditionally with my eye up to the eyepiece, and you can see this through the viewfinder on a mirrorless camera, as well as in live view. On a DSLR, it's only available in live view if it's available on your camera at all. Very, very helpful with focusing on anything, but particularly with macro. I rarely shoot macro handheld, but when I have to, if I'm out and I see something and I've just got to get a picture of it, this is the technique I use. I set the camera on burst mode. I focus as best I can using focus peaking, and then I hold down the shutter button and I rock back and forth toward and away from the subject while the camera takes a series of frames. It's a spray and pray method of shooting. But often out of the bunch of rapidly clicked frames, you're going to get one where the focus is pretty good. Still, it is a hit and miss method, and I really recommend a tripod whenever possible. I might use this method when I'm shooting a bee on a flower, for example, when there's no opportunity to set up a tripod, because by the time you do, the bee's gone. but it is my fallback method if I can't use a tripod. And then you can also use focus bracketing and focus stacking to get deeper depth of field. We're going to talk more about that after the break. One of the challenges of macro work, maybe the biggest challenge of macro work, is the depth of field is very, very narrow. And you need to decide which part of the small subject that you're shooting that you want your viewer to focus their attention on. And you need to make sure that part of your subject is sharp. Deciding where to place your selective focus is trickier than you might think when the depth of field with macro is so shallow. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here I've got a dying iris flower. And let me define my terms so you can understand what I'm saying here. When I talk about the front of a subject, I'm talking about the part that's closest to the lens. And when I talk about the back of the subject, I mean the part of the subject that is farthest away from the lens. Now, flat subjects or relatively flat subjects that are positioned fairly parallel to your sensor are going to have greater depth of field than subjects that have more depth. So in this image, the depth of field isn't too bad because this subject is not very deep from front to back when I view it from this angle. It's pretty much parallel to the sensor, although there is some depth, maybe half an inch or so. I set the aperture at f11. I focused about halfway into the subject, and it's quite sharp throughout. But if I take exactly the same subject and turn it, this is shot the same flower, the same lens, roughly the same distance from the sensor to the front of the subject. But at this angle, the back of the subject is much farther away from the front of the subject and much farther away from the camera. So the subject is deeper when I've turned it this way. This time I shot at f16 instead of f11, and yet this has less apparent depth of field. There's less of the iris is in focus. The reason for that is in the previous one, the flower was pretty parallel to the sensor, so more of it's sharp. Here, the flower is angled, so the flower is deeper. That means there's greater variation in distance between the sensor and the different parts of the flower. The actual depth of field is not less, but it appears to be less because we've turned the subject. Hope that makes sense. The thin slice of focus takes in less of the subject than it did in the previous angle with the flatter angle. This photograph of Peter Juzik's that I showed you earlier, the microscope slide was exactly parallel to the camera's sensor. And so he was able to get the whole field of view sharp. In other words, his subject is completely flat with no depth. He's positioned his camera looking down on it, absolutely parallel between the sensor and the slide. And so that it's got 100% depth of field. This is a straw flower. It's about 2 to 2.5 inches across. This is what it looks like when I shot it at f4. Pretty narrow depth of field there, very thin little slice of focus. And this is at f11. Noticeably more depth of field, but still not very much depth of field. So you can see that when we get really close to a subject, even stopping down your aperture quite dramatically is still not going to get you very much depth of field. And some people like this look. It's not my style. Here we have a dried rose and f2.8, which on this particular lens is wide open, and you can see it's very shallow depth of field. But even at f16, it's not sharp front to back. When you use selective focus, you choose a particular area of the subject that you want to be sharp, and you allow the rest of the subject to fall out of focus. And it's really important and really tricky to choose exactly the right place to focus. To get started with this approach, you want to focus on the area that you really want tack sharp. And then what I suggest is you experiment, shoot at all your different apertures and see what you end up liking. So shoot it at 2.8 and 4 and 5.6 and all the way up to as small an aperture as your camera has. This shot was actually 13 focus bracketed images taken of the front half or so of the flower. And then those were stacked in Helicon focus, and the back half or so was not included in the bracketed set. So it is blurred. So this is an example of selective focus, but it's done in a kind of a non-conventional way. And as I say, we'll get more to focus stacking in the second half. I don't do much selective focus. It can be very beautiful, but it's just not my thing. I really prefer really deep depth of field because I enjoy seeing all the minute details. So there aren't very many examples of selective focus in my work. But if you like that selective focus style, look up Kathleen Clements. She is a master of selective focus flower photography and does workshops out of Maine and online. And I believe she's done a workshop recently in Victoria, actually, or may have one coming up. It seems to me she was going to be out here. Now, like a lot of photography, the background matters, and I think it matters maybe even more in macro photography. You want to have a neutral background with no distractions. If you have any bright or sharp or colorful areas in your background, they're going to draw the eye away from the subject. So it's best to keep your background at some distance from your subject. Ideally, you want the background to be blurry and perhaps a little bit darker than the subject. You can focus stack with a wide aperture so the subject is sharp from front to back, but the background is blurred. And again, we'll get to focus stacking. The other thing you can do is you can print a neutral or blurred background and then clamp it to a piece of cardboard and either use a clamp or hold it behind your subject. This is particularly helpful if you're shooting in a garden where there are a lot of flowers in the background that would be distracting. So you go out to Butchart Gardens and there's flowers everywhere and you find the perfect blossom. You just take your 8x10 print, or I think mine are 11x14 print, clamped onto a piece of cardboard, and you just have your friend hold it behind the flower. You take your picture and it's like you've done it in a studio. So I just went out with my camera one day and I took a bunch of out of focus foliage shots and then had them printed. These were both shot with a printed out of focus background behind them. The second image, I added a texture in post to the background. I just thought it needed a little bit more interest. I could have also just placed the subject some distance from an area of foliage and then worked with focus bracketing and kept the background blurry. Next, we're going to talk about lighting. Is there anything that you want clarified in what I've just talked about? Any questions to this point? Okay, we'll give you another chance later. So lighting options. Generally, soft light works best for macro, not direct sunlight. And there are exceptions. There are exceptions to everything in life, right? But on a sunny day, if you're out in a garden, it can be helpful to position a diffuser between the sun and the subject to soften the light. You could use a piece of parchment paper in a cardboard frame. You could use one of these, the 5-in-1 reflectors that so many of us have a diffusion panel included in that 5-in-1. A frosted shower curtain makes a good diffuser. And I've even had just somebody stand between the sun and the subject, just so it's not in bright sunshine. Light from the back or the side can be really nice because it'll help to bring out the delicate textures. And with backlight, you can get a nice rim light on your subject. You can use flash or an LED panel with diffusion, preferably off camera. Because macro subjects are so small, you don't need a big light source. A 9-inch LED panel or a 9-inch mini softbox on a flash can give really nice light for flowers. I prefer to use flash because flash gives you way more light output and it's more modifiable. So that's what I prefer. I'm planning a trip to Hawaii this February and I will be taking my flash. People might think, why would you take a flash to shoot outdoors in Hawaii? Well, because it's going to work really great for flowers. And you can use a desk lamp for lighting your macro shoots, but you'll want to shoot raw and correct the white balance in post. Different light sources put out different colors of light, and so you need to be aware of that. For a while, I used to shoot with auto white balance, but what I found was that the color wasn't consistent from shot to shot in a series, and that became a problem. So now I shoot everything in RAW with my white balance set to cloudy. And that gives me a warmer look, which I can adjust in post. But the advantage is that all the shots come out with the same white balance. And that's a huge advantage when you're shooting a series. If you want to submit to a lot of competitions and magazines and things, a lot of them are looking for series, and your series has to hang together. So having the white balance correct in all of them helps a lot. Here's my typical lighting setup for macro, and I'll use a flower as an example here because that's my most frequent subject. I usually set up with my light source on the left. So in this case, we have a window on the left with indirect light. You don't want direct light. If the sun is streaming directly in, hang a frosted shower curtain or some sheer curtains or something like that to diffuse the light. Then I have a reflector on the right-hand side of my subject and a backdrop some distance away to avoid getting shadows on it. My subject is usually somewhere between 12 and 30 inches from the window. The backdrop when I'm doing macro is usually a couple of feet or so from the subject. If I'm doing portraits, it's farther away than that, but for macro, a couple of feet works fine. And then I get my exposure dialed in, and then I'll move the reflector until I get the amount of fill I want in the shadows. So I'll bring it closer to the subject to make more fill, or further away from the subject. Sometimes I might not even use a reflector if I want the far side to fall into shadow. And you can try different angles with the reflector too, to get the light just the way you want it on the flower or whatever subject you're shooting. Here again, this was shot in window light with a black backdrop and black glass. Now, I do use flash quite a lot for macro, more and more all the time. And there is no need for specialized macro flashes or ring lights. Any light mounted on the camera, including ring lights, gives a very flat light that really doesn't show the texture of the subject. If you want to show texture, you need side light to reveal that texture. And ring lights are most often used on the camera. So that's going to be a front light. You're not going to get that texture. On the picture on the right-hand side of the slide is a ring light. It just fits around your lens and gives you a ring of light. And some of them you can adjust the intensity of the light from each half independently. I have used these. I have a couple of them sitting in a drawer. I never use them anymore. I also found that the macro lights on the two little arms give a little bit more control over the light, but they're finicky and they're sometimes underpowered. These two options, ring lights and macro lights, might be more useful if you're just documenting bugs, but for fine artwork, I don't use them. The top left is the Canon macro flash, which sells for $1,000 US. The one underneath it is the Olympus macro flash, sells for $650. My Godox flash was about $160 Canadian. And I can use it for any kind of photography, not just macro. I added in a flash controller for $130, and then I have a very versatile kit that I can use off camera and gives much nicer light than the much more expensive specialty flashes. So I would urge you to not let yourself be talked into a special macro flash. I just use a regular Godox flash and a diffuser. And by the way, if you haven't looked into flashes, Godox is sold by Strobe Pro in Calgary, and they have fantastic customer service and videos on how to use all their gear. I can't say enough good things about those folks. I buy all my Godox stuff from them now. I have used both the Rogue Flash Bender, which is shown in the upper left corner of this slide, and a mini softbox quite similar to the Lastolite that's shown as well as a larger strip box, and they've all worked very well. I use them off camera to create a nice side or back light. But for some subjects like insects outdoors, you need to be a little more mobile and nimble. So in those cases, you can still use a regular flash on camera with a shoot through diffuser. So on the left, you see a shoot through diffuser, and the way it works is the hole fits over your lens and you position it with the diffusion material facing up between the on-camera flash and the subject. And you can also make a diffuser out of a Pringles potato chip can for tiny subjects like bugs. There are lots of instructions on how to do this online. Just Google Pringles diffuser and you'll find lots of information on how to do that. I have a couple of those. I don't shoot bugs, so I haven't really used them. But if I was shooting bugs, I think they'd be a good option. These sunflowers were shot with diffused off-camera flash to the side to reveal the texture. And like much of my work, these are focus stacked. You can create some drama and some interest by lighting just part of your subject. This parrot tulip was positioned so that the stem acts as a leading line, and it was shot in a dark room with a light just directed at the base of the flower. And I think it really gives it a sort of a more romantic mood than if I'd shot it fully lit. I recently treated myself to a Godox Studio Light, which gives more light than my regular flash does. And I bought a collapsible gridded strip box to go with it. And I use that to just skim the light across part of my subject. So here the strip box is off to the camera left, and I've aimed it so that it's kind of aimed a little past the flower, and just the edge of the light hits those edges of the flowers. And I think it creates a more interesting one. I shot it with the light more straight on from the side, lighting the whole flowers. And to me, it wasn't nearly as interesting. These were shot with diffused flash to camera left and slightly behind the flower. Notice how the backlighting shows off the little hairs on the stems and the leaves. When I first heard about backlighting, I thought it meant that you had to have your light directly behind your subject. And that's not really the case. You can do it that way with some things, but as long as you have it behind your subject and off to one side, aimed at the back of your subject, you can get this kind of lovely highlighting, rim lighting. And I love how that makes little hairs stand out. So any questions there? And if not, we're going to take a 5-minute break in a minute. And I have a little assignment for you on your break. So don't leave until you get your assignment. But before we get to the assignment, any questions on anything we've talked about so far?
I have a question. Could you remind me where you said you bought the Godox lights, please?
It's a company called Strobe Pro, and I think it's strobepro.ca, might be .com. They're out of Calgary.
Thank you.
Erin, you have a metering question. Would you like to ask it?
Yes, please. So I've just bought a really cheap reverse ring mount and extension tubes.
Yes.
So I'm shooting on manual, so I don't have an aperture. I'm just wondering what I should set the metering on.
Good question. I'm assuming that your extension tubes don't have the electrical contacts?
Correct. They were $12.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just say make life easier on yourself and get one that has electrical contacts, but that's not helpful. What you could do is set up your subject and meter it before you get that gear on. Just put any old lens on and meter for your subject, and then use that reading when you go to do your macro work.
Okay, so I don't have like a separate light meter. What I mean is like on the camera.
No, on the camera.
Yeah.
You get yourself focused and see what the exposure the camera wants to give you. Do you shoot on manual or aperture priority or shutter priority?
I'm shooting on manual right now.
Okay, so take note of what your ISO and your aperture and your shutter speed are to give you the right exposure. Just jot that down and then get your macro gear in place and use those settings.
Okay, yes. So it's like, do I want partial metering or evaluative metering to like get me those numbers?
Oh, okay, good. Okay, now I understand what you're
Yes.
asking, I think.
Because that's basically what I'm doing. I'm just messing with ISO and
Yeah.
shutter speed.
Most cameras have 2 or 3 different metering modes. And for macro, see, if I was shooting this with the black background, I don't want the camera to get fooled by that black background. So for this image, I would probably set it on spot metering and I would meter off the flowers. If I use evaluative metering, it's going to look at all that black and say, oh my goodness, it's too dark, and it's going to overexpose for me.
Okay.
Okay. When you go on your 5-minute break, folks, I know that's not a very long time, but I want you to keep your eyes open and see what you notice in your house that might make an interesting macro shot, just as an experiment. And I also want you to think about, if you did take a macro shot of that, would you get enough depth of field with a single shot? Because after the break, we're going to talk about focus stacking, which will tell you how to get depth of field with more than a single shot. So look around your house, see what might make an interesting shot, and decide if you think you could get enough depth of field with one shot.
Okay, that's great, Judy. Thank you. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and it's just 8 o'clock right now. So we'll come back at it's 8:01, 6 minutes after 8. See you then. So Judy, we'll just start up in say another minute. How's that?
Sure, whenever you're ready, Alec.
You betcha.
Judy,
Yeah.
there was a lady that asked a question earlier, how to unmute herself.
Yeah, we've got that sorted out, Robert. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll mention it too. Yeah. Well, welcome back everybody after your break, and I hope you've all done your homework assignment. Just as a reminder, given that you're muted, if you wish to speak, you just need to press your space bar and you will be unmuted until you release it. Or of course, you could just unmute yourself at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Okay, Judy, back to you.
Thank you. So how many of you found something interesting in your house that you think you could practice macro on? What kinds of things did you find? Okay.
I have an orchid in the kitchen and I also have a zinnia on the kitchen table.
Oh, lucky you. That's great.
Yeah.
Somebody
I've
said,
got some Nerine flowers.
great. Somebody said they have a dahlia, a maple leaf, a penny, and a ruler. And those are good things to practice on too. You don't want to wait until the world's rarest butterfly lands on your porch rail. You want to practice on all kinds of ordinary things. Somebody else said shells, and yep, I've done macro on shells too, and I'm going to be doing some more. Those are all good things to practice on, and I would suggest that you do that. I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to launch into talking about focus stacking now. When Mary contacted me for this talk, she was very specific that you folks were interested in focus stacking, and I do a lot of that. So I want to make sure you get your money's worth on this part. Focus stacking is a technique that is used to overcome the problem of shallow depth of field in macro and close-up work. I really love precision and detail, and so this is a technique I use a lot. So what's involved is taking a number of frames, each focused at a slightly different point, and then taking all those frames and stacking them either in the camera or in software to create an image with deep depth of field. Now, often when we talk about bracketing in photography, we're talking about exposure bracketing, which is taking the same image several different times at different exposures. And sometimes we blend those in post, but this is different. This is focus bracketing, where we focus, we take several shots all focused at different points from front to back of the subject at even intervals. And it's a two-step process. Some people use these terms interchangeably, but they're two different things. Focus bracketing is when you're actually capturing all those individual frames. And focus stacking is when you combine the frames together, whether your camera does that for you or you do it in post. I have heard a macro teacher say that focus stacking is a waste of time, that you should just shoot with a narrow aperture, but I think that's bad advice. I think there are two problems with that. Number one is diffraction, a softness that tends to happen at narrow apertures. And that is, granted, much less of a problem than it used to be with film. I have not been able to see diffraction in my images at f/16. So I'm just not going to worry about diffraction. But more importantly, some subjects you're still not going to get sharp from front to back. I think of amaryllis and calla lilies, any of these deep flowers. Sometimes I do just use F16 and I skip the bracketing if it's going to do the job. But there are lots of times when I need to use focus stacking to get the sharpness that I want through the whole frame. So this was a very large tulip in my garden this spring. It was about the size of a good sized coffee mug. And I shot this at F16, and you can see it's very, very sharp at the front of the flower. The petal at the very back is not 100% sharp. It's got some detail, but it's not 100% sharp. But the part I really wanted to draw attention to is sharp. And so this one works for me. I didn't feel a need to go back and focus stack this one. And I very often will start by taking a shot at F16 and seeing if it gives me what I want. Or I'll just use the depth of field preview button on my camera. But sometimes with a deep enough subject, you do need to have focus bracketing and focus stacking. So this orchid is focus stacked. Here, the field of view is less than about 2 inches. I'm very, very close to this flower. And shooting this close, it just wouldn't be possible to get the whole frame in focus without focus stacking. Here again, I wanted sharp focus from front to back on these. So they were both focus stacked at each shot was taken at f4. The amaryllis was maybe about 5 inches deep, and the calla lily with the leaf on the left was maybe 8 inches from front to back. I would consider the amaryllis to be a macro shot and the calla more of a close-up. And again, if you're entering a competition, make sure that you fit within the parameters of the competition. So let me show you tell you how I do my focus bracketing and focus stacking. Olympus was the first camera maker to build focus stacking and bracketing into their cameras, but other camera makers have followed suit in some of the mirrorless cameras. I have a friend who has a Nikon Z6, and hers will do focus bracketing. My son-in-law has a Canon R6, and it will do focus bracketing. Although I don't know any other camera that has quite the versatility of Olympus and OM systems. My OM1 will focus bracket up to 999 frames automatically, which I can then combine in software to make one focus stacked image. And it will even focus stack up to 15 frames right in the camera to give me a focus stacked image without the need to post-process. So step one is to turn on the focus bracketing. I go into the menu system, and the first one there that you see in blue is just turning the focus bracketing on and off. Then I have to set the total number of shots that I want the camera to take. I guess at this, depending on the depth of the subject, the chosen aperture, and the distance from the sensor. It takes some practice, and you'll see some pictures in a minute, and I'll tell you how many shots it took to get each of those. Then you have to set the focus differential. The focus differential is the amount of shift in focus point for each shot. And you have to really experiment with that. It's sort of like, how much farther into the subject do you want it to focus each time? And it's got to be equal increments. Your desired focus differential will vary depending on your camera, your lens, your aperture, your distance to the subject, and apparently whether the leprechauns are dancing that day or not. In other words, there is not a set formula. It really is trial and error. And smarter mathematical minds than mine have tried to figure out a formula, and they've just thrown their hands up. There doesn't seem to be one. Then the last thing in my camera menu there is to set the charge time if you're using a flash. And I am using flash quite often now. I remember saying to my husband some years ago, if I ever figure out how to do focus stacking with flash, there's going to be no stopping me. And I have figured it out, and it's very cool. I think it's a good idea to use the sharpest aperture you have on your lens, and you can Google to find out what that is. I know DxO Labs was one of the websites that would rate the sharpness of different apertures on different lenses. And then when I press the shutter button, after I put these settings on, I press the shutter button, usually with a remote release, the camera automatically takes the set number of shots up to a maximum of whatever number I entered for the number of shots. And if it runs out of subject before it hits that number, it'll just stop. And then I have my set that's ready to stack. I take that whole set of images into Lightroom and I check the shots to make sure that that every image has at least some part in focus. It really amounts to choosing the first and last shots in the sequence that have sharpness. And then I take that whole set into some kind of software to combine the sharpest parts of every image to create the focus stacked image. And I use Helicon Focus. For me, it's the most suitable software for this. It's specialized. That's basically all it does. And Helicon Focus has 3 different formulas for stacking the images, A, B, and C. And each one of those methods has variables in it that you can adjust. So you have to experiment there too. I find that for most of my flower shots, method C in Helicon with smoothing set at 2 works the best. And I actually got that information from Ethan Beckler, the guy that shoots the sand grains. He suggested that's what he uses for a lot of his. And so I tried it and it works pretty well for mine too. But sometimes you don't always get a perfect result. Sometimes I'll use all 3 methods and I'll end up with 3 shots, one done with formula A and one done with B and one done with C. And I'll take those all into Lightroom to see which is best. And if one is better than another in one area, but another one's better in another area, then I'll take them into Photoshop as a stack and I'll mask to get the best sharpness throughout the image. If that sounds like a lot of time-consuming work, it is. You're not going to come out of a day of focus stacking with 300 images ready to go. It takes time. There is a way to tweak right in Helicon, but I have never been able to make it work for me. Someday I'll find somebody who knows how to do it and get them to sit down with me and I'll pay them to teach me how to do that. But I have found some good workarounds. Now, Helicon isn't the only game in town for focus stacking. There are several other options. Photoshop is kind of slow at focus stacking, and I think there's a limit to how many images you can stack. Affinity Photo, On1 Raw are both options, but I think they also both have limits. I know On1 Photo Raw does for how many you can put together. And I told you my Olympus camera, my OM1 will shoot up to 999 images. So that's not much help to me if I have a focus stacking software that'll only stack 60. So Helicon Focus and Zarine Stacker are the top focus stacking softwares. I've used them both. I think they're both good. I just happen to choose to use Helicon. So let's look at a few examples where I've used focus stacking. Here we have I think this is a Zinnia. And the sharpest aperture on my macro lens is 5.6. So I set it on 5.6, and if I take a shot of the Zinnia, I get a really shallow depth of field shot at this distance, as you can see. The petals at the back aren't sharp, the petals at the front aren't sharp, the center seed pod isn't sharp. There's just a slice of sharpness through the petals. And that's not what I want. That's not my style. So staying on 5.6, I focus stack instead, focus bracket and focus stack. So again, I take a series of shots. The camera focuses at different points on the flower, starting at the front, going all the way to the back. In this case, I focused on the part closest to the camera, set the camera for bracketing, press the shutter with the remote release. The camera took 22 shots, automatically moving the focal point back in incremental steps, until it got enough shots that every part of the flower was in focus in at least one frame. So I may have had it set for 89 shots, but when it got to 22, it said there's no more flower, so it stopped. Then I took those pictures into Helicon. And you got to be aware when you're doing focus stacking that there will be some cropping of the image at the end. So you need to shoot a little bit loose, leave a little bit more space around the subject than you really want to have so that you won't lose any vital parts of it. I could have used the in-camera focus stacking ability of my OM1, but the resulting image for my in-camera stacking is JPEG. And I really prefer the greater information contained in a TIFF file. And that's what I get when I do the processing in Helicon Focus. So I'll either take the raw files into Helicon, or I'll export TIFFs from Lightroom and process the TIFFs in Helicon, and my final finished flower will be a TIFF file. Another reason that I prefer to do the stacking in post rather than in the camera is there are times when you'll have a tiny insect that you didn't notice, and it'll move, and it will leave a weird streak in your focus stacked image, because the camera, if it does the stacking, it gets that insect in every one of those positions, and you get this weird streak. If I focus bracket in camera and then do the stacking in post, I can check for things like that before I do the stacking, and I can avoid that. If there's a bug and it's moving, I just go into each individual frame and get rid of the bug, and then I stack them. Here again, we have one shot at f5.6, and it's got the tips of those stamens sharp. And this shot is 50 shots at f5.6. And it's a focus stacked image, and you'll notice that the petal behind the stamen still isn't sharp, but the stamens and the pollen and the petal down to the root of the stamens are sharp. You get to decide how much you want to have sharp. If you want more sharp, you take more shots, or make the aperture smaller, or both. I prefer to stay with my sharpest aperture most of the time. Here's a dead dragonfly. I had my aperture at f4, and this one took 49 shots. That's about 3 inches of the dragonfly, and it is sharp from the very tip of the tail right to the wing. This is a golden jewel beetle. It was maybe 3/4 of an inch long or so. It was shot at f4.5, and if I remember rightly, this one was about 90 bracketed shots. I have since learned that there are whole protocols for how to handle and preserve dead insects. And there's a source I'm going to give you at the resources end of the presentation at the end. It's a fellow named Alan Walls, who has a photography channel on YouTube, and he goes into how to preserve insects if you want to do macro, and how to clean them and all the rest of it. It's very, very helpful information if you're into that kind of work. And this high key Calla was 5.6 as my aperture, and took 24 shots to get everything sharp from front to back. Now, if your camera doesn't do focus bracketing, if you're still on a DSLR, or you have some other camera that doesn't do focus bracketing, you can do focus stacked images, even if your camera doesn't have that. But it's much harder, and it's much fiddlier. First, you have to take the first shot focused on the part of the subject that is closest to the camera. And then the next part is the tricky part. You have to take a series of shots at equal increments all the way to the part farthest from the camera. This is really hard to do. You can imagine how finicky it is to try to get 50 shots with the focus differential being equal between each one. It's like, I want to move the focus point 0.5 millimeter back, and then another 0.5 millimeter back, and another 0.5 millimeter back. That's pretty hard to do by turning your focus ring. If you're interested in doing focus stacking, I really recommend a mirrorless camera that has the focus bracketing built in, or a focusing rail, particularly a motorized one if it's in your budget. They tend to be more expensive. For me, the OM1 and the Olympus OMD cameras are the perfect choice because they have it all built in. They make it easy. But here's what a focusing rail looks like. For any kind of macro, you need to focus very precisely, and stability is really important. For focus bracketing, you have to focus a number of shots with those even increments. So if you do that without a focusing rail, you're probably going to get areas that aren't in focus interspersed with other areas that are, and it's just going to look weird. You're going to have slices of focus and slices of out of focus and another slice of focus. This is going to be strange. A focus rail becomes a great asset then. It's almost a must-have if your camera doesn't do in-camera focus bracketing. And if you want to use a focusing rail, you need to use a tripod or another support such as a macro cage. And there's a fellow on the next slide. He teaches you how to build a macro cage if you're a DIY kind of guy. Macro rails come in a wide range. They start at about $50 and they go up to about $600 US. The more expensive ones, like the Cognosys Stack Shot or the Novaflex Castell Micro, are electronic and therefore very precise, and they're at the high-end price-wise. You can keep those in mind in case you win the lottery. The non-motorized ones have a little dial and they have a scale that you can see there, and it helps you to be more precise in moving exactly the same amount for each shot. So a focusing rail can be useful for that. This fellow, Alan Wall's photography on YouTube, has very detailed, very helpful information about focus rails and how they work and what the good ones are. He does reviews of them. He also has detailed information on how to build a macro cage. He shoots a lot of insects, so a macro cage is a nice piece of gear for him to have. The flowers I shoot tend to be all different kinds of sizes, but if you're doing insects, a macro cage really works great. He teaches you how to clean and preserve dead insects, and he has a whole bunch of other topics related to macro. So let's look at some of the challenges you're going to face with macro work in general and with focus stacking in particular. We've talked about the challenges of depth of field and where to set your focus point. Those are going to take some practice. Another challenge is that when you use a narrow aperture, you either have to slow the shutter speed down, which can introduce movement, or raise the ISO, which increases noise. But adding light in the form of an LED panel or a flash is a third option that can overcome that. Another challenge you're going to have is you're going to realize how filthy everything is. You buy flowers, you bring them home, they're so beautiful. You put your macro lens on them and oh my gosh, they're covered with dirt and dust and hairs and all kinds of stuff that you would never notice. So this was just a stem of leaves that I picked the other day, brought in, took a quick shot to show you. And there's all this stuff on it that I've put blue circles around. I don't want to take a macro shot that's got that garbage in it. The lower left, there's holes in the leaves, and then there's some kind of black debris at every one of those stem intersections. You don't want that. And there may also be small bugs that you didn't notice. So I keep a set of makeup brushes handy when I'm doing macro work to brush my specimens off. But even so, I still do get some dust and some bugs. And so the healing tool in Lightroom has really improved lately, and it's pretty good at removing those kinds of distractions. So whenever I do macro work, I always go in and look at it at 100% to 200% magnification. And I go over every inch of that image to make sure that I don't have embarrassing things that are going to show up when I've hung it on the wall. Another challenge with macro is that many surfaces have glare on them that you may not even notice, particularly things like foliage and glass, but even insects will have glare, and it's unattractive. It obscures the detail. So this shot was taken, it's a straight out of camera with no filter on the lens. And I want you to notice what happens if you add a polarizer filter. It takes away most of that glare. And it improves the detail, intensifies the color a little bit, but really reduces the glare. I'm going to go back a slide so you can see it without the polarizer and then with the polarizer. Huge difference. Now, this tip applies not just to macro, but to foliage and water and glass shots and things like that. Polarizers are not just for skies, but for macro of flowers and leaves and things, very, very helpful piece of kit to have. The challenges increase when you go to focus stacking. You've got to decide where to focus initially. And actually, you need to do that with any kind of macro. But with focus stacking, you need to decide how many shots do I need? What focus differential do I need to use? What aperture should I be using? What distance should I be from my subject? And there's something called halos and worms that I'm going to show you in a minute. And it's very time consuming. And that last one, there's no way around that. It is just very time consuming. So let's have a closer look at a few of these and how you can deal with them. Well, this is obviously not macro. This is my treasured vintage Cookie Monster cookie jar, but I use it for illustration. He's a willing model. When you're focus stacking, you want to have the first frame focused on the part of the subject that is closest to the camera. So how do you know what that is? Let's say that I want to do this as a focus stacked image. I need to determine what part of the cookie jar is closest to my sensor. So I place the subject, I set my camera on a tripod, and then I walk around to the side and I look at it edge on. And often that way I can tell what's closest to the camera's sensor, and that's where I need to place my initial focus. But if I can't tell, I might stand up a pencil in front of whatever I think is the closest to the sensor, and then focus on the pencil. And I'll probably get a frame or two where the focal point is just in front of the subject, but that's okay. I don't have to use those frames, but at least I won't miss the area that's closest to the camera. In fact, I usually focus just a little bit closer than I think is the closest part to make sure that I have all the shots I need. Shooting tethered can be great when you're doing focus stacking work. I don't do that yet, but it is on my list of things to learn. Tethering rather involves linking the camera to a computer or another sizable screen so that every shot shows up on the big screen and it's easier to check. For now, I take a series of shots and then I walk the card over to my computer and to make sure that I have all the shots I need. You can tell I was running out of fresh flowers when I went to demonstrate this challenge. This is focus stacked. It's 13 frames at f4. There's no healing done on this yet. I wanted to show you what happens when you enlarge this to 200%. You can see that we've been photobombed by a number of bugs. And it's bad enough if those bugs don't move. Miraculously, these ones didn't. And I just have to go in and take them out with the clone tool or the remove tool. But if they do move, as I said, you're going to get a smudge that shows the trail of where they moved. So always go over your macro shots at 100 or 200% and check for all these things that you would not have noticed with your eyes. I went back and looked at that and it still was hard to pick up the bug, particularly the green one. So all these areas I had to go in and clean up before I considered the picture finished. How many shots do I need? This takes some practice and some trial and error. This is a California poppy after it's lost its petals. I took 13 focus bracketed frames here at f5.6 and then focus stacked them in post. And this subject was only about 3/8 of an inch deep, but still about half of it is not in focus. And I'll show it to you a little bit larger here so you can see that. Only about the front half is in focus and the rest is not. Now, this isn't wrong necessarily. You can do this as an effect if you like it. It can be a type of selective focus. In my case, I was trying to get the entire thing sharp, and I had quite a bit of frustration because what I finally ended up learning was that there was a conflict between the new OM1 and a particular Godox flash controller. And I happened to have two Godox flash controllers. When I put the other one on, it all worked fine. But with this flash controller, it would only take 13 pictures with the flash and then it would stop. So that was a good learning for me. And there might be times when you want this effect. Here we have just a piece of clover from my lawn. So it's fairly small subject. This was shot at f16. With no stacking, and so it's a single shot, and it has some good sharp areas, but it's not sharp back to front. So I thought, okay, let's try focus stacking it. Here we have 39 shots focus stacked, each shot at f4.5, and it's still not tack sharp from front to back. There's lots of areas that are sharp, but I also failed to shoot loose enough here, and the subject is cut off. So I pulled back about 2 inches, an inch or two, took 39 shots again with the same aperture and focus differential as in the shot before. And here we've got almost everything sharp. So you can see there's a lot of variables at work here, and it takes some trial and error to get what you want. But the more you practice, the more you're going to get a sense of how many shots you need in a given scenario. And there's never any issue with, asking the camera to do more shots than you think you need, because you just trash those these days. By the way, some of the images I'm showing you, like this one, are my practice images. I strongly encourage you not to wait till you have a great subject. Practice this with your comb, your toothbrush, anything you've got laying around the house. Even though I've been focus stacking ever since I got my first Olympus camera over 10 years ago, I still practice. And then when I have a great subject, I have the skills and the experience to make the most of it. Here's what I call halos. And these are one of the most frustrating things that I run across. Halos are a fuzzy area along the edges of areas of contrast. In this image, you can see there's a fuzzy area here where the white meets the red. And it shouldn't be. I mean, focus stacking is supposed to give you tack sharpness from front to back, but you get these halos where the software hasn't been able to figure it out quite right. And sometimes you can solve this by cloning, or by taking 2 or 3 different renders from Helicon and masking them together. As I say, Helicon's supposed to have a built-in way to do this, where you can go in like you would in a Photoshop mask, but I've never been able to make it work. Sometimes I just can't fix it. Here again, we're looking at this at 200%, and if you look at this edge, you can see there's fuzziness all along the outer edge of this petal. It drives me nuts. In a case like this, I keep the source images in the hopes that the software is going to improve in the future. But for now, that's an unusable image for me. No one would ever notice on social media, but I know the halos are there and they would show up in a print. So I keep it. I give images like this. I put them in a stack in Lightroom and I give them the keyword halo. And then next time Helicon comes out with a new software edition, I'll go back to one of those stacks and I'll restack it and see if they've got rid of this problem. But it's not a foolproof process. And the other challenge is what I call worms. And I don't know if you can actually see these, depends on how big your monitor is. They are little lines of tiny little green, purple, and white dots. And they probably are from single pixels on the original source images. I enlarge to 200% so I can see them, and then I clone them out. There's a little line of green ones here, and there's a little line of white ones here, and there's some purple ones up here. And then over here we have dust that I would never see just by looking at the flower, but it shows up when you go to 200%. And I will go in and I'll clone all that stuff out and make it look right. Again, it's very time consuming. One more quick spot for questions, and then I'm going to go on to something else. But do you have any questions to this point on focus stacking?
There've been a number of questions.
Oh, you were there and now you're muted again. Is that Alex?
Yes,
Yeah,
there we go. There are some questions that have come up in the chat.
Go ahead.
Now let me just see here. There are some other DSLRs that can do focus bracketing, like the Nikon D850 does.
Oh,
I
really?
understand. Yeah.
Good. Good.
And a question from Graham: could you increase the number of input photos by stacking several different sequences and then restacking the results?
I'm not quite sure what you're picturing there. I suppose if you didn't move your camera or your subject, you might get away with that. But I would be tempted to just start over again and focus a little bit ahead of my subject and let it go with more shots than I think I need and just get one whole sequence that would work.
Okay.
What I was thinking of was if you're running out of capacity for number of shots that you need in the software you're using, take a sequence of 1,000 photos and then put the number that it will handle, and then the next number it will handle, and then the next number it will handle, and then take those 3 or 4 results and put them together.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that one.
Hmm.
I mean, that's why I use specialized software that doesn't put those limitations on me, but you raise an interesting point, and it might be worth an experiment.
So you're sort of restacking the stack, stacking stacks. Another question was, with a non-stacking DSLR, how would you obtain the equal differential that you're referring to?
That's
Other
where
than, that's where the focusing rail is the,
yes, that's where the
Yeah.
focusing rail comes in, because it has a scale written on it, and you turn the knob. It's a knob that's more sensitive than your focus ring on your camera. You turn the knob and you watch the scale, and you move it like a millimeter each time.
okay.
If you got the expensive electronic ones, you just tell it what to do and it does it. But focusing rail makes it possible. A camera that does in focus bracketing makes it easy.
Jim Fowler noted that he once mounted his camera on a tray with a 32 thread screw so that a half turn moved the tray 1/64th of an inch. So he created his own focusing rail, if you will. He said it was fiddly, but it worked. So,
That is very clever.
yeah.
Yeah, very clever.
There's also a comment here about Helicon Remote. Richard, you had that comment. Would you like to enlarge on that?
Yeah, that's tethering software, right?
Sure, yeah, that's tethering software. Can use either focus increments, or it can use a powered rail. I've used it extensively. Personally, I like it better than the D850 built-in stacking, but that's just my opinion.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I haven't used Helicon Remote. I've only used Helicon Focus.
That works well as well. I use it extensively.
Good.
And another question from Alan is, do you utilize light boxes?
I have. I don't usually. I think for some kinds of subjects, they can be great. I live in a small townhouse and I do have a light box, but I tend to keep it put away, and I just use my flash or my window and work on my dining room table. But yeah, they can be useful if you've got space for them.
Great. Okay, those are the questions that come up in the chat there, Judy.
Okay. Well, we're going to look at creative possibilities now. If all you want to do is document your subject, then these kinds of fixes that I've been talking about with worms and halos and dirt and bugs and things may be all you need to do in post. But macro, like any other kind of photography, can go beyond merely documenting a subject. I like to bring some artistry and self-expression into my macro work, just as I do with other kinds of work that I do. I want to not just show you what my subject looked like, I want to show you how I felt about my subject. And some of that happens with the choices around lighting and composition, but I also enjoy using creative post-processing to do that. So Black-Eyed Susans like this always feel kind of old-fashioned to me. And so I lit this carefully with a flash in a gridded strip box, and then I finished it with an antique look. The calla lily on the left with its sensual curves reminded me of the old 1940s and 1950s portraits of Hollywood starlets. And so I wanted to give it that kind of treatment in post to be reminiscent of that style. And the tulip stem on the right seemed to want more of a low-key, mysterious treatment. So don't say to yourself, okay, I've got a picture of my subject and I'm done. You know, maybe you are, and that's fine, but you're not limited to being done. You don't have to be done. You can still work with your macro work. I remember the original OM1 camera. I could never afford it back then when it came out. But I do remember the early film cameras that I used and how tactile they were, the knurled knobs and rings on those cameras. And so when I took this picture of an original film OM1, I turned it into this sketch because I thought it brought out the texture more. So here was a way to use my post-processing creatively. This macro shot of hummingbird feathers was not all that interesting all by itself. but I played with it and turned it into an abstract that's quite striking. This was done in an app called Circular Studio, which is available for Mac and iPhone and iPad. It's not available for Android, but there are similar apps for Android that will do this sort of thing. And I use the same app to do this one. You see the original tulip on the right, and this was the treatment I gave it. And this image made it into a juried show in Pennsylvania. This diptych was done in the same app and was also accepted to that same show in Pennsylvania. This was made from a different macro shot of a tulip. And these days I'm doing a little more abstract work. I recently did a walk along Nanaimo's waterfront to shoot some macro abstracts. And this is 2 of those abstracts combined into a double exposure in post. And I shot this nautilus shell, which was a good exercise for me, but not a very interesting photograph. And then ventured into the whole altered reality area. This is not AI. This was manipulating the pixels in Circular Studio and then doing some compositing work to make an image that had some meaning to me. Similarly, I took this close-up shot of a calla lily and manipulated the pixels in post to create that sort of portal, and then added in one of my night sky shots and some clouds and a balloon. So you can be as creative as you like with macro, just like you can with any other kind of photography. So here is the book that I was mentioning to you that I think is absolutely the Bible of macro photography. It's called Macro Photography, The Universe at Our Feet. And you can get it through doncom.ca. Don Komarechka is the author. And I'm not affiliated with Don. I've never met him, but I think he's a genius. And his book is well worth the money and the time it takes to study. He goes into topics like gear in great detail, much more detail than I've given you tonight. He talks about high magnification macro, ultraviolet macro, water droplet diffraction, macro composition, snowflakes, frozen soap bubbles, editing, and even 3D macro. And he offers workshops online. He is a Canadian. He was living in Ontario, and I know that he moved to Romania for a while, and I don't know whether he moved back. I seem to remember that he moved back to Canada, but I wouldn't swear to that. But he's a very engaging speaker, and he's definitely worth seeking out. He also has this book called Sky Crystals. I think the price, let me go back. The price on the macro photography book is $40.08 for the Kindle edition. And I like the Kindle edition because I can search it. And then his Sky Crystals book is also available on Kindle. It's all about the snowflake work he does. It's just over $24 for Kindle version or $500 for the hardcover copy. A very beautiful book. And some online resources for you. You might want to take a screenshot of this. We have Doncom, of course, and then Alan Wall's photography is the guy that talks about focusing rails and preparing insects and macro cages and all that stuff. Then Kathleen Clements for information and classes on selective focus work. She doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't do focus stacking, or at least it's not a big part of what she does. She's more into the tiny slice of focus, which she does beautifully. And then Cupodi, the close-up photographer of the year website, cupodi.com for inspiration and for competitions, and a really great newsletter and a Facebook group. So in conclusion, macro and close-up work can take a lot of time and effort, but it's also endlessly fascinating with tremendous scope for exploration. I think once you start working with macro, you'll find yourself seeing differently and finding macro subjects everywhere, even in your lunchtime glass of Coke. So I hope I've got you excited about the possibilities and given you enough information to at least get started. And by the way, if you enjoyed this presentation, you might want to sign up for the talk I'm giving for CAPA tomorrow at 4 o'clock Pacific time. It's called Getting to Wow, and it's open to Kappa members. So thank you for having me back again. I know the topic of macro is pretty involved, especially if you're new to it. So I've left some time. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions and comments.
Sure.
Do you have any?
Yep.